Right, shall we make a start, and then anyone who joins this from this point can catch up. Peter, do you want to say anything before we start, or should I head straight into housekeeping and intros?
Yeah, I think it's just welcome as usual, and thank you to you, Jonathan, Miguel, Isabel, and of course to Steve and Mike. So I think it's over to you, Jonathan. But
Okay, cool.
Great.
Cool, thank you. Well, yeah, as I mentioned before, it's being recorded, so we'll publish that on YouTube after the event. We've been experimenting with the format of these series, as I think you're all aware. So again, slightly different format today. So very pleased to welcome both Mike Vernon, long-standing member of society, and Steve Toft. I know you guys have worked together quite a bit over the years, and I'll let you guys introduce each other more fully in a second. But the format we're going to adopt today is Steve and Mike are going to have a conversation for roughly the first hour. At that point, we'll go into breakout rooms. So it'll be randomly assigned, aiming for 4, 5, 6 people per room. And there will be just a little bit of a question to kind of tee up those conversations. So that'll run till 20 past 6. In those breakout groups, what we're going to ask you is to just have a rep to be nominated from each one during the discussion to feedback. So kind of quick feedback when we come back at 25 past 6. When we start at 25 past 6, at that point, if you want to put any comments, thoughts into chat, please do so. Because when the quick fire feedback from breakouts is finished, that'll probably take us to about 6:35. We can have the more free-flowing Q&A and comments coming off the chat and normal kind of hand-raising stuff on Zoom, and that'll take us through to close of the session at 7 o'clock. So I'll pass to you, Mike and Stephen. Thank you very much in advance for this session on cultural dynamics.
Been looking forward to it.
Well, thank you for inviting us, and good evening, everybody. Mike and I decided that we would introduce each other. I'm going first, so I've got no idea what he's going to say about me. But I will pitch in and start on about how I met Mike. I mean, Mike, I know. Spent the early part of his working life with Rolls-Royce and BT, but by the time I met him, he was running his own company, and he was working with PricewaterhouseCoopers. In fact, actually, I think it was still Coopers and Lybrand at the time. It was just before the merger.
It was.
And I had just come back from a project. I'd spent about 18 months in Brussels. And I think it's fair to say my state of mind was wired, is the best way of talking about it. And I was sent on this program by PwC to do this thing called double loop learning. I had no real idea what it was, but that's what big companies like that tend to do when you've come off something big and intense like that. Oh yeah, you'll stick him on a course. So I met Mike with some others at a country retreat in Oxfordshire. And after about the first half day, I was sitting there thinking, how am I going to spend 3 days in a room with this guy without hitting him? I was getting quite cross with him by lunchtime because he was asking me all these questions, which I really needed to answer, but really didn't want to. And the more he asked me, the more irritated I got. Then it came to a point where he asked me something, and I said, well, I don't know. And he said to me, well, what would you say if you did know? Right, that's it, I'm going to hit him. But I didn't. I stuck with the course, and here we are all those years later. I've worked with Mike on several different occasions in several different companies. We've done consultancy work together. I still reckon whenever I talk to Mike, there are occasions where I understand about half of what he said and remember about a quarter of it, but that quarter is still really good stuff. So and we also did some development work on the Isles of Scilly, where a whole group of us went away and did things helping the local farmers. And I think it's the only personal development course I ever come back from where I got a suntan because we were outside most of the time. So yes, what more to say about Mike? He's just an inspiring guy, and I'm still learning from him after all these years. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Steve. That's interesting to listen to. I find you inspiring as well, by the way. The early relationship that we had was characterized by some very challenging feedback from you, which encouraged me to think, how have I got to learn my way into the relationship with this guy? Now, Steve, you have to understand, did his master's degree in organizational behavior with his dissertation at his master's degree in organizational culture. So he's a really good partner to bring into this sort of conversation that we're going to have about culture. The thing I love about Steve is humor, his capacity to have a good time. If you ever go out with Steve, you'll have the best time. But the other side of it is, Steve is an extraordinarily capable writer, and I'm so envious of that, because I write like rubbish. I just write like some sort of, I don't know, demented robot. I could equally I could actually look like a fake chat GPT rather than a human being writing out of their own experience. So I'm so envious. But Steve does lots of work in the sort of political arena, which is also part and parcel of this whole cultural thing. And there's also got an extraordinary, extensive encyclopedic knowledge of historical aspects, which are also important in how did these things come about. So from the point of view of mutual education and learning and development, I find Steve equally inspiring. So between us over the years, he's propped up my lack of knowledge, and I think that I've also encouraged him to reflect on perhaps the more taken for granted aspects of some features of social life. So I think I like Steve a lot. He's a good friend. He's been extremely supportive to me over the last 18 months together with his wife, Sue, and I'm very grateful to him for that. And I'm equally grateful for the opportunity with the Society to have this conversation with him. So without further ado, Steve, I think you want to bring the reverse process and ask me questions.
That's right, Mike. Well, thank you for that. And the history angle gives us a good hook to start on the first question, really. I mean, you started work as an engineer. What was it that triggered your interest in organizational culture?
Oh, right. As a young man, I have to say that the notion of culture was something that belonged to wealthy, entitled people who could tell me all about opera and painting and arts of various forms, and seemed to have extensive knowledge about things that were completely arcane and unknown to me. I think I fell into the camp of uncouth youth at that particular time. So the notion of culture was quite abstract and distant, if you like, and belonged to people other than myself. I didn't see myself as being a particularly cultured person, although with hindsight, I did live in a particular kind of culture. I think from an engineering point of view, there were a couple of things. One, I got into electronics from mechanical engineering. And one of the things that I came across was circulating current theory. From mechanics, free body diagrams. And there were several sort of issues with Bessel functions, like initial conditions, boundary conditions, and a whole range of sort of issues on Fourier analysis with frequency and how you built up harmonics. So I think some of the foundation thinking in the engineering sides, both mechanical and electronic, really sort of placed me in a position when I became a very young line manager at the age of 22. And we were, at that particular time, I joined British Telecom from Rolls-Royce. And at that particular time, they were implementing total quality management. And John, you'll know all about that. And I had the luxury of meeting a guy called Joe Duran, by the way. I don't know if you knew that, for a very brief period of time. But one of the things about total quality management is it was a complete challenge to the prevailing culture of British Telecom at the time. because it started with what is the value experience of the user of the company. And at that particular moment, we had a whole range of initiatives begun. And one of the things that I came across was a project in which a problem statement had to be made. And the problem statement went like this: the problem we've got is a shortage of staff. Therefore, the project becomes about recruiting more staff. Now, at that particular time, the idea of changing the organizational process, the systems that underpin that process, and really finding a way through to delivering against requirements that were understood in another part of the system was completely alien, because people were in their particular silos, in their foxholes, in their particular fragment, carefully cultivating their tribal difference from the rest of the system and causing problems in the relationship patterns, the ability to do things to cost, on time, to quality, as defined by the user. And it just became really curious to me as to how this happened. So I set about looking at a whole range of aspects, starting from the outcome and working my way back through to how on earth did this begin? And the first notion that I had about culture cycles, which has become a signature process which I use, was legacy thinking supports legacy practice, creates so low productivity, and stabilizes in the fourth step, the status quo. So what I discovered was a whole range of practices which were supportive of a status quo, which was inherently dysfunctional. And it just, as a manager, caused me a major hiccup. So I set about investigating how on earth could I change this. That's how I got involved with the notion of culture.
And when you were looking at that from with your engineer's hat on, what sort of things did you do to try and change that?
One of the things that I discovered was, I'll give you a small example, was we had a kind of fault control, because I was responsible for a whole load of subs apparatus line and small business telecommunications. And there was a problem because we couldn't seem to get more than 6 faults cleared per day per linesman. So I looked into this and I discovered that there was a signature event at 10 o'clock in the morning called the tea trolley went round the control with buns and tea. So I looked at that and I thought, I wonder what the linesmen are doing while these lads are having buns and tea in the control. And I discovered there was a local cafe where they knew the control would be quiet, and they all gathered there for bacon sandwiches. So I went down to the cafe at 10 o'clock in the morning and stayed for about, 3 weeks, and had bacon sandwiches, a cup of tea and a chat and all the rest of it. I then altered the timing of the tea trolley going into the control. And what this did was it changed the faults per linesman cleared per day to 7. So a culture of expectation about timings of sandwiches, cakes, tea, bacon sandwiches, and so on, caused me to look further into. So I wonder what else is going on. What are the habits and practices then that our people are adopting, which, although are useful from the point of view of nourishing the body and perhaps building friendships across the whole piece, nevertheless interfere with one of the key objectives, which is to provide a service to the people who are paying for their phones to be repaired and to have dial tone, etc., etc. So that took me into, how did this come about? The causal effects. What were the sort of antecedents of this? How did it grow into a situation where, rather than being able to fulfill the potential of the faults cleared per linesman per day, we were actually sat down in the, I would say, the local government thinking about how things should be done rather than the commercial aspects of what should happen. I got that from Joe Duran, by the way, John, in one of his descriptions about visiting guys who were pouring metal from containers, one of which one of the guys down in the pouring area used a copper rod to clear the spout to pour with, and he had fewer defects per shift than anybody else, because nobody else cleared the spout with a copper rod. And that small amount of copper made all the difference to the pouring ability of that particular metal. So that's that took me into, so what is the managerial process that has permitted this? How are the objectives being set? What is the education and training that people are getting? I wonder if they're aware of the implications financially and what it does to the cost base of the budget processes that I am connected to and held accountable for. So there's a whole range of things that arose out of that, but it started with, I wonder why at 10 o'clock, the whole system seems to stop.
So you're looking there at, it's something going on that's beyond the technical question, and you investigate it by talking to the people involved. And I just wondered what, if you had to reach a definition of organisational culture. I mean, there are a number of them that get bandied about, and I think one of the most common ones is the way we do things around here, which has always struck me as hopelessly inadequate because it doesn't really get you to the depths of what's going on. If it was all about that, you just change the way we do things around here. And often when you try to do that, that's when the problems start. So I just wonder what your definition was, what your working definition is.
Well, first of all, yes, difficulty does begin because people weren't particularly happy about me appearing in the cafes or altering the timing of the trolley. I have to tell you that. So I had to learn a little bit about negotiation and conflict management, particularly in difficult discussions with people who'd got used to their habits. In terms of defining culture, it's a tricky one because we ourselves are the products of the cultures that we grew up in. And most of us are unaware of the fact that we've been socialized into particular concepts and ways of experiencing others around us. So culture isn't something that just happens. It's something that we're involved in propagating unconsciously through the way in which we've been educated, socialized, parented, and our early work experiences. A lot of folk, when I talk to them about culture, think of it as a static phenomenon rather than something which has got a long history of evolution over thousands of years. We aren't just having a culture. We are the products of cultures that have been forming over many generations, which we are just the recent recipients of, and we therefore act out and behave out of those cultural imperatives without being aware of the fact that we are that culture. This leads to a phenomenon, a problem, which is why I got into the double loop stuff, which is we try and correct the very thing that has caused us to be the way we are, using the concepts and methods that cause us to be the way we are. And therefore, if you look at culture from that particular point of view, culture becomes a regulatory process for society without society being aware of the fact that its regulation is controlled by something which has emerged through human interaction and patterns over thousands of years. And we are the inheritors of it, but educated into it at a time when we're unaware of the fact that we will become participants in and contributors to some of the very problems we are trying to solve now. So when you look at the geopolitical stuff, the climate stuff, the Slovakian prime minister being shot just, half an hour or so ago, all those kinds of things are the consequences of prior actions which have led to consequences now. So I define culture as a set of circular causality patterns inherited and propagated through the enculturation of us as individuals, and that circular causality is an inevitability arising out of the genetic inheritance, the deoxyribonucleic acid inheritance of ourselves as primates, and the behaviors that attach to the expression of the instinctive and subsequently nurtured behaviors that we have as a consequence of being in the culture that we're thinking. And this is why people find it difficult to change. Here's a conjecture, an axiom, if you like, an axiomatic postulate, which is, how would you change the very thing that has caused you to be the way you are while you unconsciously use the very tools that reinforce the thing that you're trying to change?
Yes, I like the point about it being unconscious and taken for granted, which I think was the main one of the main things I took from Edgar Schein's book, which I read probably 30 years ago now for the first time. You know, he was talking about this whole question of shared assumptions, and the fact that we share the assumptions. Because they're assumptions, we don't know we're assuming them.
Correct.
And you know, when you get into trouble abroad, if you do something when you're on holiday in an unfamiliar culture, it is quite often because you just assume something. You know, for example, you assume the bus goes according to its timetable rather than the bus going when it's full. Both are logical, but
Yeah.
you blunder in with your sort of you know, European assumptions and get wrong-footed, and yeah, that's a sort of simple illustrative example of the mistakes people can make in when they're coming into organizations, that sometimes they assume one thing and the organization assumes another, and sometimes it can be, you know, the analogy I use is like an organism rejecting a transplant. So you'll bring in this great new leader or this brilliant new facilitator to help change the culture, and then the culture spits them out.
Yeah. And your question to me is,
spat out.
you want me to comment on that?
I was going to say, have you ever been spat out?
Oh, well, once or twice, yeah. I mean, there is a phenomenon by Maturana called autopoiesis, right, which is the ability of a system to self-generate, renew itself. And if you look at the multiple possibilities for culture as interacting, interconnecting feedback loops with information flows, communication, agendas, power, many other sort of features that comprise those interacting, interconnected feedback loops, and the authority of the agents within them who've got authority to redirect the way in which they work, then the notion that we have a homogeneous culture is a complete fallacy. So if you get into the practicalities of this, when we did the work on the supply chains in automotive, for example, the multiple ownership in the automotive supply chains, and also in aviation when I was doing the project on wing maintenance with Rolls-Royce, the whole sort of issue of multiple ownership, multiple agendas, different cycle times, different beliefs about what management comprised of, the whole notion of what was a supportive system and mechanism and how people should be treated, varying according to gender, varying according to religious view of the world, varying according to underlying philosophies, varying according to self-belief in people who have a view that, who am I to succeed? They are all smarter than I am. How can I compete with this? Should I just give up? And when you sort of move yourself into that world of multiple interacting cultures, then the notion that you can actually use your culture to dominate the rest leads you into a problem called autocracy. And what autocracy seeks to do is to become a controlling system to damp out the potential for autonomy and purpose and goals which are different from the autocrats in the wider system that this is happening within. And you can see evidence of that around in Europe at the moment and in other parts of the world. So the whole thing about culture is we have multiple cultures. There is no such thing as an organization which has a single culture. And in fact, the whole notion of what is the boundary of an organization needs to change as well. Because if you look at a supply chain as a transient organization, legitimized by, and then look at the various ownership structures that attend that particular supply chain, then the organizations are actually forming and disbanding continuously. The opportunity in that is to learn from each other how better to work together, in order to learn more about how we can be better as partners for the future. Unfortunately, because of the primate inheritance, we tend to look at those differences as an opportunity to make other people wrong, to push them away, to find ways of criticizing them. And in one particular workshop where I thought it would be a really good idea to have members of the automotive community meet with each other, one of the major sort of owners in the supply chain told the guys who were running Rover Motor Corporation at that particular time that they didn't know what they were doing. And if they only took their advice, all would be well. So it leads to a lot of escalating errors, misunderstanding, and difficulties, because we need to evolve better cultural capability and understanding of how to leverage the differences between us in favor of a better outcome for all. Now, I don't know if that addresses the point you're bringing, but that's my response.
It sort of leads me on to something else, actually, as you were talking. One of the things that I was reflecting on was that we've probably started talking about organisational culture probably some 30 to 40 years ago, when the likes of Argyris and Shine began to write about it, probably in the 80s. But it almost seems to me that the more we've talked about it, the less we've understood it. And I think that the insights that people like Argyris and Shine brought were almost lassoed by eager senior executives thinking, here's another thing that we can use to manage the company. Yeah. So there was a lot of talk about how you get control of your culture, or how you build a strong culture. And then there seemed to be a backlash of saying, oh, well, actually all that, this stuff's actually really difficult, so we'll put it away in a box. But then when you get something going wrong, like a merger, for example, the cultural aspects of different organizations are very rarely measured and analyzed at pre-merger stage. But after the merger has gone wrong, which, let's face it, most of them do, the culture is almost always blamed. So we come back to this thing, we don't really know what to do with organizational culture as a concept. Are we using it as a thing to manage the company with? Are we using it as something to blame when things go wrong? It seems to be one of those sort of concepts in organization studies that we've kicked around for 40 years without really knowing what to do with it.
And so?
Well,
let me speak to that then, if I may.
Yes, I assumed you would.
Yeah. First of all, yes. The number of definitions of culture out there, and if you ask ChatGPT for how many cultural definitions are there, it comes back with a very nebulous answer saying there are many, basically, if I summarize it. But if you take a look at mergers and acquisitions and all the rest of it in the sort of financial world, there is a particular culture cycle in the financial world which runs like, we're greedy for more. That greed disposes each one of us as players within this merger and acquisition to have a self-interested agenda which we do not make discussable or reveal. Not only do we have a self-serving agenda to make payments on my helicopter, which is what one senior executive said to me, but equally, we will misrepresent and lie to each other as we make them form this contract to merge or acquire. Now, if all goes well and we benefit at the expense of the other, then we can go complacent. But if we don't benefit and we can't get our way because we haven't sufficiently well manipulated our way through this to gain advantage over the other, then we'll see you in court. We'll get really grumpy about it in order to reinforce the fact that we need to get our greed needs met because more is better, isn't it? Now, there's a load of fallacies in all of that. But in those situations where those culture clashes occur, there are a number of things. One, you find that the people who are the architects of the finances of that really run that financial sector cultural cycle. I got into culture cycles, by the way, when I was looking at implementing lean production into aviation and automotive, and looking at cycle time and takt time, as it was called there, to identify the cycles as greed, self-interest, lying or manipulation or misrepresentation, and complacency or aggression as a cycle that continues to repeat and reinforce itself, leads you to a particular problem. At the level of the negotiation for the merger, you're already in trouble, because you need to understand what the multiple personal agendas are as part of the process. And the other side of it is, in each merger and acquisition where you've got individuals who are engaged in that, they're not individuals in the cultural world that I inhabit. They're representatives of networks of interest. They are not free agents. They are constrained agents, and the degree to which they have freedom or discretion in the negotiations often isn't visible because they've got a directing group behind them, which is causing them to bring a particular point of view, which they may or may not agree with. So there is and if you understand that culture, it's why senior guys that I've always worked with at sort of C-suite level always find me difficult, because I ask the questions about these matters, and they do not want to have the personal agendas revealed and how they play into the way in which they're negotiating these things. Now, the other side of it is, if you then get a merger or an acquisition, which is created on the back of a financial fallacy, and you can see how that can happen with all the stuff that's going on in the corrupt environments in, well, pick a country. They're all sort of variations of kleptocracy in some way or another. Then at that particular point, and you run into good middle managers who are trying to, we have objectives, we have projects, we have deliverables, we know how to evaluate them. We're running a strict system of rule-based implementation using TQM or Six Sigma or whatever it is. Then at that particular point, what you'll find is that the efforts of the middle management, who are doing the best that they can in difficult circumstances, are completely undermined by the conditions that the merger and acquisition has actually produced. They find themselves onto a hiding for nothing.
I worked in an organisation. I remember going through a merger or work with an organisation, should I say, where you had the assumptions about the other lot were deep rooted before the merger had even taken place. So these two views of each tribe, as you might put it, had ingrained themselves and almost become part of the culture of each group before the two sides of the organization even came together. It was quite, going back to what you were saying about the tribalism, it was interesting to watch it happen. If you thinking about the relationship between organizational culture and cybernetics, which is what we are supposed to be talking about this evening. What do you think cybernetics can? How do you think cybernetics can help us understand organizational culture?
I think cybernetics is key to understanding organizational culture, because cybernetics, in a sense, is the study of circular causality and the consequences of that. You can take a look at cybernetics from a number of points of view, and that is the point of view that I take. Circular causality leading to interacting circular interconnected interacting feedback loops, and the study of those is the basis of cybernetics. Now, if you take a think about that for a minute, National Health Service, water boards, international aggressions, Boeing, all sorts of companies around the piece are all in need of an approach which is an integrative approach, which looks at how to find the best pathways through the interconnected feedback loops to create process pathways that create beneficial outcomes. Cybernetics is, from my point of view, and I've taken a look at across a whole range of approaches over the years, cybernetics is, for me, the outstanding and central necessity to start to address some of the issues that we face on the planet that go beyond the ability of an individual or a community or an organization or a country to address. So to take a look at circular causality and to look at the different processes of that in the different locations with the different populations and agents and power-based operations is really central to what is called second-order cybernetics. And from my point of view, it's essential that we get more, shall we say, awareness in the political classes and the leadership classes of the power of the approaches that cybernetics endorses. Now, we can talk reflexive, recursive, autopoietic, viable systems, requisite variety, all these sort of tools and techniques. They come into play underneath the umbrella definition. All of those things come into play under the umbrella definition. But in order to understand the coercive power of an inherited cultural dynamic, cybernetics is, to me, a key in that process.
So we've had some questions coming in the chat. Do you want to deal with those now, or do you want to deal with those later in the Q&A?
Hang on.
Later in the Q&A.
So we're saving those for the Q&A, are we? Okay,
Okay.
Great. That's fine.
So defining cybernetics is key.
Yeah.
Circular causality, and the Buddhist philosophy, by the way, is all about causality, how things become the way they are. But circular causality over time, creating cultural patterns which society is unaware of largely, that it's involved in, maintaining, legitimizing, and perpetuating under the sort of concept in cybernetics of autopoiesis, in which culture simply regenerates itself from generation to generation without people noticing.
So what you're talking about, if I think about a lot of the popular literature, I'm thinking of the sort of books you buy in airports now.
Yeah.
I think executives have come to think of culture, or have been told to think of culture as another management tool. Whereas what you're describing is something that will manage them if they're not aware of it, and don't take it into consideration. And
completely.
When we were talking a while back, you used the metaphor of a river, which I quite like that one, because yes, if you're skilled enough, you can navigate your boat along the river, but if you don't know what you're doing, then the river will take you away. And if you try to pretend it's not there, or assume that you can control it completely with a culvert or something, it will blow off and surprise you. And I quite like that as a way of thinking about the challenge of trying to manage organizational culture.
The word cybernetics comes from the Greek kubernetes, which means steersman. And if you think about society as a boat on the river of life, on the river of social possibility, then there's a number of things that become possible, because culture, if you like, is an emergent phenomenon of social interaction and patterns inherited and created in the moment. And if you are a steersman stepping into that river, the idea that you can actually bring together those necessary parts that constitute fragments, but put them in the proper relationship one to another to create an emergent property, which has benefits called, like, from arbitrary interventions designed to reduce costs, which destroy profitable activity because it cuts into relationships that people are unaware of, then that really takes you into sort of a backward-looking way of looking at what I'm talking about here. Because what you've got emergent there is dissatisfaction, upset, and disbelief, lack of faith in leadership, and so on. The FCA commented on these issues a little while ago in terms of the culture that they were identifying. But if you are at a sufficient level of awareness through cybernetic training, then you can take a look at this from a different point of view. It's like, what is the emergent property we need to be steering towards? And what are the necessary interventions in terms of action research or action learning or projects that contain the possibility of those action research and learning strategies that will lead us to that emergent property, which will help? Now, people talk about sustainability. And why is it so hard to improve productivity? Why is it so hard to get at sustainability? Why do we keep degrading the environments that we inhabit? How come? And the answer to that, in my view, is if we take the cybernetic view of the creation of process pathways by bringing those necessary parts together in whatever way we can to create an emergent property, then I think that's really the way that we should be traveling in this river. Steering down this river of life, looking at the possibilities, steering with mindfulness, if you like, of what the emergent capability is, so that we can, as we go, use the very forces of that river and the banks that contain it, and the underlying topography of the river bed. We can use all those features, if you like, to navigate our way towards the emergent property called respecting each other enough to change our minds through the way we listen to each other, just to begin with.
It's yes. I mean, I was just conscious that as you were talking, I was going to get a bit controversial here and
excellent. Go for it, Steve.
Talk about I went to see Nick Wallace speaking last week. Nick Wallace is the guy who wrote the book on the post office scandal.
Yeah.
He's doing a tour, and on every single gig that he's doing, gig seems the wrong word, but I can't think of another one. He has one of the sub postmasters in the room with him. And it was quite humbling to be in the same room as somebody who'd been through all that. But the interesting point that Nick Wallace made in the sort of introduction was that the culture of the post office goes back a long way. And there was a deep-rooted assumption that a certain number, if not most of them, the sub-postmasters were on the take. And that had been held for quite some time. So when the Horizon system started showing anomalies, rather than investigate it, because it was such a deep-rooted assumption, it was, well, now we've got the data to prove what we already knew. And so that was the kind of organizational root of what happened. And so strong was the assumption that even when there was mounting evidence on the other side, people still couldn't be detached from it. And I sort of sat there listening to it thinking, we know about this because it's the post office and it's a public organization. There's been this big scandal, but I've seen elements of that going on in lots of other organizations, and probably because they have a less high public profile, we don't see some of this kind of stuff. And what on earth do you do to shift those sort of assumptions in an organization before it becomes a major catastrophe?
There is a difficulty that as a society, I think we need to sort of own and face up to. And that is that the very methods we use to educate managers and young people and kindergarten and so forth really is preparing them to participate in a culture in which the ruling elites, if I can put it that way, the capitalist interests maintain themselves at the expense of the wider population. Now, if you listen to interviews of people who head up Stanley Morgan and all the rest of the banking systems and all the rest of it, they'll say that the big agenda is we have to continue with our growth strategies because that way we can help the dispossessed, the homeless, the low wage earners. Well, it's a wake-up call to come to the point where the drive for growth, the concentration of capital into the hands of the few at the price that the many pay, has actually made matters worse. Homelessness is going up, poverty is going up, educational attainment is going down in some sectors, the health service is suffering. It's not just the post office that is at risk in this. So when you take a look at this and say, all right, all these things may be true, or they may be speculative, or maybe it's just your opinion, Mike, you come down to one simple issue, which is, we are the common denominator. So what is it about us human beings then that causes us, in the face of such knowing, to continue to operate with such unbelievably bad consequences? Now, when I got into this in the first instance, I had a look at culture forms us and we form culture. There is a relationship between us. The pattern of interaction and all the rest of it that goes on between us creates an emergent phenomenon called culture, which becomes a repeating pattern, a circular repeating pattern of causality. So how does this occur? Now, it took me a while to get into it, but I had to go into the neurosciences for this, and I happened to be very lucky to team up for a short while with Baroness Susan Greenfield, who was the prof of neuropharmacology at Oxford. And when I got into it, it came up this way. Each human being stands in the present moment as a repository of their own experiences. If you like, in AI terms, we are at this moment simply training data sets of our biography. We have history, we have knowledge, we have experience, we have education, we have relationships, we have et cetera, et cetera. As part of all of that, if you read Gabor Mate, the guy from Canada, who's very strong in the world of addiction, we have also, as human beings, had many micro-traumas in our lives. Now, some of those micro-traumas are actually caused by the educational process that is used through adolescence, through the sort of secondary and tertiary education. And some people that I speak to still wake up in a sweat thinking they got their final exams still to take, and they're in their 50s. So these micro-traumas exist in our psychology, often below the level of conscious awareness. Now, what these constitute is the opportunity for the environment to create a trigger point. And I've noticed over the last 5 years, the word trigger is getting used a lot in the media. But in the world that I inhabit, which is looking at the circular causality and the relationship between the individual and the culture that we are participating in, is that trigger point gives rise to a particular reaction, which is defend attack. In the adolescent particularly, and I spent 6 years as a kind of parent governor, working with adolescents to figure this one out. So the trigger comes, it activates feeling states, anger or irritation or fear or, sort of anxiety or something else. And that defend attack actively causes a judgment of the other person who has stimulated the trigger. And from the point of view of the person whose trigger's been activated, and they are unaware that they're unaware that trigger event, that micro-trauma, was created somewhere in their personal history and isn't actually a consequence of the behavior or the thing that's just been said by somebody else, but is attached to them. We make them wrong. Now, this sets up a phenomenon called cognitive bias in the world of psychology. And cognitive biases are actually the attack dogs that protect the belief system. And the belief that you are wrong for causing me to feel this way, to activate this unpleasant physiological arousal called I feel really angry or afraid, then leads to another consequence, which is we develop a narrative to excuse ourselves at their expense. So we justify, explain, we create rationalizations, and we collude with others to describe exactly why this other person was wrong and how they should stay wrong. And we complete the cycle by reinforcing the very triggers that cause that in the first place. Now, because of the way in which we are educated, we aren't actually educated into reflecting on how we as human beings, strange loops of internal processing, as Hofstadter would call it, how we then actually learn our way past that into a more productive way of growing ourselves as a consequence of experiencing those triggers, to see those triggers as a moment to choose a different response, like tell me what I've done, explain to me how, show me what you know, what's in your experience that. There are a range of possibilities rather than creating a situation in which these money-grabbing sub-postmasters, and just the word sub already disposes the expectation, if you like, on free energy thinking, to seeing them as subhuman, sub-managerial, whatever it is. And in order to protect our sense of self, which is what this period of the adolescence is all about, is we create a sense of self at the expense of people around us, oftentimes, is in order to maintain that sense of self, it propagates in some people right into their 60s, 70s, and 80s. We do not, and is overlaid by, in one particular case, 2 PhDs in different topics. The underlying processing of knowledge is a function of the adolescent cycle. And if that is at a point of arrested development, then the inevitability of making other people wrong in order to maintain my sense of self at their expense is the consequence. And you see it over and over and over again. Now, the people who are doing this, of course, are colluding with each other. So you'll find that in the situation you're describing, the senior management team, the lawyers that support them, and all the rest of it, will all come into a sort of groupthink, which creates a blindness to the full field of data and blindness to the possibility that some other explanations exist. And you can trace it right back into the genetic inheritance of us as evolving apes.
I think one of the things I gained from working with you that's helped me the most is understanding what those trigger points are in me, and then deciding to do something different. It doesn't always work. Quite a lot of time.
Of course not.
But just that sort of self-awareness to be able to take a beat and decide, actually, you know, I could respond to this differently. And if it's difficult for individuals to do, then trying to get an entire organization or group of people to do it, it's a tall order.
It is a tall order, and I think one of the omissions and one of the things that is strong in the Cybernetics Society is reflexive listening. And that is listening, as it were, to what are the implications for me as a human being? What are my cognitive biases? What are the triggers that actively come alive in me? How do I know that those are triggers? What are the feeling states that attend those? There's a whole range of consequences that get into this. Because the other side of making others wrong, you see it a lot, hear it, which is, I'll show you, you're wrong to make me wrong. I'll get you, I'll plot my revenge over many years sometimes, and see if you can make me passive aggression. I'll show that you were wrong and you've got no chance of making me do whatever it is you're trying to maneuver me into doing. So if you take a look at that, we've got an emergent phenomenon called culture, which creates a set of societal experiences for the emergent of the adult human being, which completely ensures that they reinforce that adolescent cycle at the expense of people around them in order to maintain itself at the expense of the wider population. And if we continue that way, we are frogs in a saucepan of our own making. We need to jump. And I think that the approach that the cybernetic community can bring is the point at which we need to jump. We're actually past it, but we can help understand what jump we need to make.
It's 6 o'clock, so that feels like a good point at which to go into the breakout groups.
I think it is.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both so far. That was brilliant. Feels like you've taken us quite a journey. Several lifetimes worth of wisdom, I think, there. So what I'll do, I'll put up the slide to take us into the breakouts. Isabel, if you're okay, I'll let you talk through the top half. Whilst you're doing that, I will paste the breakout question into the chat, though I think our learning from last time's session is once you're into the breakout rooms, I don't think you can see the chat. So you need to either take a screen grab or copy it off chat. So let me just pop that on screen.
Jonathan.
Oh, hi, Isabel.
Hi, everyone. As you can hear, I'm thick with cold, so I'll keep my video off. Cool, I can see that. Thank you.
Brilliant.
So this is really, I guess, a thank you, Mike and Steve. That was super interesting. And I guess this kind of sets the tone and I guess the culture from which we'd like to step from this discussion into our breakout rooms. So I think it's things that we all already hold in ourselves, but just to remember, assume good intentions, embrace the oh my gosh, my brain has definitely got a cold. Ambiguity and resistance. Active listening, building forward on each other's contributions, and also deferring judgment, mainly also about your own ideas and just welcoming, I guess, the discussion that comes forward. So looking forward to what everyone's discussions are like, and then coming back together after the breakout rooms. Thank you, Jonathan.
You're
Or
muted.
mute still, yeah.
Sorry.
It's all right. I can't get my words out, and we can't hear you.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So the breakout question. So this is something that Mike and I developed in prep for this session, and it's sort of taking the learning from this and getting it to then focus on cybernetics. So assuming cybernetics itself is a cultural object, could you identify the cultural processes by which it was created? So I will put us all into breakouts. As I said, I put the question in chat, but I don't think you'll be able to see chat once you're in the breakout. So please do a screen grab or a copy of the question. What we'd like you to do is in the breakouts, obviously discuss what your answer is to the question and just decide which one of you will give quick feedback when we all gather back. And then after we've done that, we'll then go into kind of normal free-flowing Q&A. So any other thoughts or questions at this point, please also put those into chat and we can then pick up on those when we come back. Right, so I will hit the button to put you all in breakouts. In terms of time, if I call you all back in at 6:25, so that's just over 20 minutes, 20 minutes to discuss the question. Any concerns or questions before I hit the breakout button? Right, well, welcome back, everybody. So what I'll do now is just, if one person from each breakout room could just feedback your discussion conclusions on the breakout question, and then we'll go into kind of rolling Q&A and comments as we do normally. So who'd like to go first?
Malcolm, you had a lovely historical textual take.
Oh, well, I suppose well, we didn't really, well, in trying to answer the question, I sort of referred back to Paul Pangaro's article, which I think is excellent. Many of us might have read it, called Cybernetics and the Counterculture. And I think it's very much sort of how after Viner in 48, you go through the 50s and the 60s, and it's very much wrapped up, I think, with techno-utopianism. You've got Timothy Leary in there with the Dropout Tune In. Marshall McLuhan is filtering around. Basically, Pangaro's article cites or references all of them, the whole Earth catalogue and so on. I quoted a poem by Stafford Beer, which is excruciating, but adds to the whole hippiness of it. And then you've got that other poem, All Watched Over, by Machines of Love and Grace. So I think that is where it actually perhaps comes from. Other points I would say is I certainly objected, and I think Catherine and Margaret maybe not were more okay with the idea of an object. I'm not. I don't see cybernetics as an object. I see cybernetics itself as a process, or maybe more challengingly, cybernetics as itself a culture. And we talked then towards the end about taking Margaret Mead's idea of a cybernetics of cybernetics. What is the culture of this society? What is the culture of the wider cybernetics movement? I mean, who've only been here 3 years, perceive a certain few cardinal articles of faith, like there's almost a revelation of Maturana, a kind of slightly anti-scientific aspect to it, and maybe one or two other things.
So do you have a question?
No, not a question. This was the report back.
Okay.
Thank you. Mike, Steve, any immediate comments on that, or do you go through the other breakouts and then?
Just one really from me. I don't know if you want to go, Steve, before me.
Yeah, you shoot.
Okay. Is the idea of a cultural object can be a process, a procedure, a policy, a model, a technology, a war, a society, a political chamber, something else. So I agree that if you use the expectation of the word object is to mean a physical object, contained and to itself, then yes, I understand. But no, the idea of the word object in this particular context of cultural object is most people look at culture in terms of the objects that are produced, the consequences of the process, without being aware of the process of creation of the object. So it's really to sort of come to terms with the way in which we use the language around this.
Thank you. So, Malcolm, I think you're in breakout room 3 with Margaret and Catherine. So that leaves breakouts 1 and 2. So who would like to go next from either 1 or 2 to give feedback?
I don't mind having a go if that's group 1. We had Hilly in our group, and unfortunately she doesn't have audio or video now, but which is a shame because she was going to be our spokesperson and would make a more brilliant job of it than me. But very interesting discussion. So to feedback very briefly, that point about language is important as a kind of point that we came to. The first observation, this was from Pele made, is that the different societies, the different cybernetic societies, have appreciably different cultures and potentially understandings of what cybernetics is. So they all claim that word of the steersman, Kubernetes, as a kind of language root. And then in kind of further expansion of that, it seems to be that in a sense, the dominant books or thinkers in the societies differ somewhat, and each then of the different societies, ASC versus CIBSOC, for example, have different key reference points and have maintained that culture from maybe from a kind of inception or near inception point. Who were they reading when they founded the society kind of argument? And that's kind of persisted, metaphor, obviously, and by constitution with the VSM, etc. But anyway, so that led us to see kind of cultural objects or something in the plural. And the point about language then becomes very important because, in a sense, we can make a general statement about the role of language and the choices that it, from Maturana, the kind of choices it either enables or obscures from view, the language we are working in, but also then a kind of technical language like cybernetics and the ways in which, different ways in which that might be taken up and understood, given a different cultural background. And finally, we took on that DNA question about free will, which Miguel raised, and then very cheekily said he had to go.
Yes.
And be very interesting to come back to that. So just to summarize, we note that cybernetics has enabled different cultures in different professional societies, and the explanations for this we can kind of explore and have a go at. But that itself is a very interesting phenomenon. That if we go from society to society, we encounter slightly different cybernetics.
If we didn't have the differences, how could we make each other wrong, Peter?
Well, maybe it's the problem with the single truth. You know, maybe culture is an ecology or something. I don't know.
Well, it's an interesting. I mean, we're from. Oh, we Elena Group 2, and John has seemingly left.
And John has had to leave.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that, you know, we talked about a variety of different things, but you're talking about language, and now you're talking about cybernetic societies. You know, both Elena and I have many cross-organizational or feet in lots of little in different organizational cybernetic organizations and systems organizations. So that we didn't pick up on we didn't look at cybernetics in a sense as a society, you know, like societies or how cybernetic. We were talking about, I guess, cultural processes, and then trying to think about how cybernetics informs them. So we sort of twisted the question around in terms of the way I think we went about answering it. We talked about it within the context of organizations, but I certainly brought up language because, you know, I'm very conscious of language, and I'm particularly dancing between America and the United Kingdom. I mean, I live in the States and have done for 40 years, but I grew up in North London, as those of you that listen to accents might perhaps pick up. Some people say my accent is mid-Atlantic, but we form judgments, or at least I have experienced in life, people forming judgments about people based on how they talk and the words that they use. And it's really unfortunate that societies grow up, you know, the cultural influences that you grow up with perhaps encourage a certain discrimination based on language use, accents and words and all the rest of it. And anyway, that was sort of, we talked about frameworks. John talked about TQM and 4 Ps and 3 Cs that he used in some organization as being important. And Elena brought up the point about rewards in organizations, about how they can affect cultural in general, people, you know, getting different kinds of rewards, and the reward structures that are either consciously or unconsciously put in an organizational setting. But I am particularly fascinated by the idea of what cybernetics is as a cultural object. And I'm particularly interested in how we might pursue that, particularly as it relates to archives and all of that which has gone before, and how relevant it is in the present. Anyway, that's what have I left out, Elena?
Not much. I think the only thing that I would bring up is the bit that I started with is that cybernetics got started in the Second World War as response to an existential threat, which was big enough for people to put aside their differences and work together and actually try to figure out, you know, what each other was saying. and consciously deal with the issue of transduction from one discipline to another and one language to another.
Yeah, and it's interesting just to pick up on that. If you look at the early stages of the Macy conferences, we're all looking at psychology, psychiatry, neurology, metaphysical experiences. So that was sort of a really interesting, I think, origin, if you're sensitive to initial conditions. Anyway.
Well said.
Could I just respond to a couple of those? I mean, I found that very, very interesting, actually. The language thing is fascinating. When I was working out in Brussels, it was a multinational organization, so all the business was done in English. But I discovered there was actually a Belgian English, and all the British and American expats who'd been out there for a while, they've been speaking Belgian English as well. And I'll give you an example. They used to use the word normally, where we would say that's something that sort of happens often. They used it to mean theoretically. So when we would say, well, should the new system automatically populate these fields, they would say normally yes, which I took to mean, well, it was doing it yesterday. Was what they actually meant was, well, according to the spec, yes, but no, it's not doing it now. So there were lots of little, there are a number of those where I realized I had to, foreseen was another one. People used foreseen where we would use planned. So, you know, foreseen to us is a sort of a bit airy-fairy, crystal ball-y, whereas when they said something was foreseen, they meant, no, it was in the plan and that's when it's going to happen. So you can imagine just from those two examples, the mess that I managed to get myself into. Again, it's the cultural application of language. The other thing you were talking about reward systems, and yeah, I mean, you know, don't get me started on this, because organizations sort of saying they value one thing and rewarding another. You know, why for a moment do they think anybody's going to be fooled by that? You know, again, it's one of those things you see stuff in the corporate mission statement, value statement, stuff like that, and then they actually are incentivizing people on doing something that's the complete opposite. And you know, the number of organizations that do this, I think, will, you know, why not just take the laminated thing with the value statement off the wall, because nobody will believe it. So I'll get off my soapbox. You nearly got me off on one there.
Nearly, but not quite. If I may go back to the language point just for a moment, if you consider that language is itself a cultural object, reified in the sense of the sociological definition of reification, then depending which culture you're in, the meaning changes. And in organizations, it's particularly true as well. So if you look at the sort of maturing of an organization from arbitrary to fragmentation, to standardizing, to synchronizing, to optimizing, to transcending, the same language used by the people shifts the meaning within each of those particular cultural enclaves. And it is a problem. Even in the same organization, you believe you're talking the same stuff, you aren't. So it works to actually say, how do you do that? Show me how you do that. And it was one of the things about the TQM stuff, about take me to where you do that and show me. What does it actually mean when you use the theory in use rather than the language that espouses a particular point of view?
I think the challenge is how do we acknowledge that constantly in our work? I mean, even in this meeting, for example, or in, because I saw in the email it said it's a joint meeting with Metaforum, but you know, whatever that means. But how do we check ourselves on that in terms of the assumptions we make in coming back to that listening and being conscious about not making judgments on what we hear or how we hear it.
I
in
think
real
that's
time.
I think that's the subject for another hour's discussion, Peter. And maybe Jonathan at some point would want to factor that in, because there are ways of doing that, but it is a big question to answer.
Yeah, I know.
Mm.
Well, we should have it then.
Well, it might take longer than an hour. One of the things that the ASC has done several times is to have a preliminary day to discuss the question, what is cybernetics? And very soon people are into the high weeds. And at the end of the day, we're usually not that farther forward.
I think you have to go back into how was the whole concept formed, and Second World War brought people together, as you say, Elena. But I think that the collaborations, the collusions, the sort of interactions between parties who have the common interest for a period of time has been going on for many, many years. And certainly if you look back into some of the philosophical points of view of, sort of Zen, Buddhism, Sufis and so on, you can see elements of cybernetic approaches from way, way, way back. So I think the multiple strands of the autopoietic contribution to the current state of understanding needs to be investigated a bit more, and that would lead us into listening to each other differently. Because if I see a different strand in the origins of your particular definition, which is helpful to me to update my definition, then you become a way for me to learn how to better express myself from the definitions that I'm using and understand better how to relate to your definition and build a different dialogue between us. And the decision point on that is at that moment of defend attack, when the feeling of irritation or anxiety kicks in, is what are the choice I want to make then? Am I aware of the trigger, and what is the choice I make? Is it to step into the dialogue, or is it to defend the pre-existing definition that I have and to assert that at your expense? Which is it?
And I think this is particularly relevant increasingly with what we're doing right now, which is transcending boundaries in this Zoom world more frequently and more instantly than ever before. And if you think about the origins of cybernetics, I mean, it was white guys with perhaps one or two women gathered in a room that they had to travel to physically, and then the notes taken and verbatims written up. Now we're in this sort of dynamic world of global communication. And even within the cybernetics world, we're now able to, as you say, sort of link up Metaforum, American Society for Cybernetics, CybCom, WASC, the South American cybernetics groups, the School of Cybernetics in Australia, colleagues in Moscow, and talk about these topics in a way that we never were able to before. And how we capture that, I think, is important, and build on it all, and understand what is actually going on.
Could I Margaret, I'm aware you put a question into chat quite early on. Do you want to just remind us of that? Oh, you're on mute, Margaret. Actually, whilst Margaret's coming off mute, Peter, were you going to say something?
I was going to explore really, and so listening to all the above, starting from all the presentations, noting Malcolm and Peter and Elena, and just to explore whether we wouldn't actually fall into a trap by seeking a definition that we can agree on. And that, in a sense, maybe that's a problem in itself.
Can I just
Maybe a kind of kernel wisdom is all we need, you know, and it doesn't have to come to a single point. Sorry, Malcolm, I think it was you.
No, I was just going to jump in and say I agree, because just a minute ago I was almost going to say that it's like you know, I don't need to define what a hammer is. I just use it as a tool. And I know, you know, hammer and cybernetics are really different, aren't they? But it's like, can you use cybernetics just as a tool? I mean, I'm thinking, I've only been coming to these sessions about 3 years, but one of the ones that does stick in my head is one of yours, Peter, about Alfred North Whitehead, where I don't think you actually used the word cybernetics once. But it was a really good counterpoint. It was a good way of coming in to investigating perhaps a social problem, because you related it to your teaching of business studies. You say no one ever even talks about process in business studies and so on, or whatever it is you teach. But I thought that was I thought that was a really good way of approaching the subject obliquely, more as a tool, a line of inquiry, rather than getting caught up with a definition.
Interesting. Thank you, Malcolm. That's very helpful. And maybe we make the mistake of a sort of an older disciplinarity, where that was founded on definitions, and most of them then struggle. And maybe a kind of post-disciplinarity is more of a kernel of common understanding that allows for interpretation, something like that.
How would you frame that kernel of common understanding, Peter?
I'm stood up here quite literally, because I'm literally one. So that's a good challenge. But I think you know, I listened to Elena, and she was making this point about the day before the ASC, and maybe the day before as process, a kind of social process, is sufficient, you know, rather than thinking that we need you know, maybe a kind of social process of matching and coming together to engage in collaboration brings us into a sufficient understanding for the days then to come. We don't actually have to nail something on the mast and say, this is what we believe, because that's the old trick. Maybe rather than a definition, we seek a process of some unifying, and then we work. Do you see what I mean? So I'm trying to, I am exploring this and tentative, but I think a kind of kernel of understanding established by a day of process, but not proven, might be a kind of post-disciplinary kind of point that might be worth exploring.
I think it's a post-disciplinary counterpoint that is definitely worth exploring within the society. However, I do wonder how we attract more members into the society without something more explicit.
Yeah, well, I mean, I liked all the points you make about the generative and the causality and so on and so forth. And I think, so it's always about optimization, isn't it? And so you don't disappear in a puff of smoke either. You need something. Yeah.
Margaret's asked me to read her question out. Before I do that, Peel has just made the point. Definitions are always composed by some particular culture.
Absolutely.
Good point.
And are therefore a cultural object.
Yes, yes. So just to read Margaret's question from earlier in the chat. So this was halfway through the first hour. Isn't there a difference between domination and status games, e.g. greed, self-interest, manipulation, etc., and culture? So difference between domination versus culture.
No. Because one has created the other, creates the other in a perpetual cycle of mutual benefit. The culture creates the status games, the manipulation, the greed. The greed, the manipulation, and the status games create the culture. So you go on in this kind of autopoietic. I still can't say that word correctly. I have practiced in front of the mirror, guys. I have. So I would say that it's a mutually reinforcing causality and a circular pattern, which is a definition of cybernetics, by the way, Malcolm.
I think from your body language, Margaret, I think you're in disagreement, but as you can't come off mute, it's probably
So
not
now
something.
I'm okay. It's just
you're
I
off
couldn't
mute.
access my
Yes.
chat. I couldn't access my chat. So I'm sorry. Yeah. So here's why I disagree in part. Because I think that these dominance games are very biological.
Yeah.
And they're practiced differently between men and women, or between the male and the female of the animal group. And if you read Sapolsky, who studied for 30 years, studied baboons, and who's a neurobiologist, he gives you a lot of insight into how there is actually just this biological organization to our interactions. And male baboons do these dominance games, hierarchy games, and the female baboons do different things. And it's quite interesting. And that's why I think your view of culture then is necessarily quite a male perspective. And yes,
Interesting.
there can be this feedback loop that engenders more of the same.
Yeah.
But I'm really wanting to make distinctions between things like political culture, political dominance games, business dominance games, interpersonal, you know, those kind of layers that you would find expressed culturally in different ways, whether you were in China, Japan, here, South Africa, wherever.
So are you saying that the definition I'm using for culture, therefore, is a dominance game because I'm a male baboon?
Yeah, basically.
I get it. I get it. I get it. I knew I liked you.
It was worth doing this just to hear Mike get called a baboon, actually. So. But I think, yeah, I mean, I sort of see what you're saying, Margaret. I think, you know, cultures can exist. Cultures can exist without the domination and status games being overt. They tend to manifest themselves when cultures come up against each other, or you know, when people from with different sets of assumptions interact, and that's when the domination and manipulation goes into overdrive. You know, you see it in different organizations, different countries, gangs, even people in different streets. It's where you get two sets of assumptions that are deeply held and start rubbing up against each other. Or in, you know, in the case of the post office, I keep going back to, even two groups of people within the same organization, you know, one of which is demonized by the other. And I think it's where you get those conflicting assumptions that to use a phrase, it all kicks off.
I'm going to disagree again, if I may. May I?
Go ahead.
Right. So when a male baboon wants to be king of the baboons, right? And some guy notices that he's off his game, some other little baboon notices he's off his game for the day, and a little distracted by a female in estrus over there, right? Or whatever the case may be. That second 2IC, 3IC baboon will absolutely go for him. Will actually try and take his dominant alpha position. It's just part of the biology of how they sort of continually self-organize, so that there is this hierarchy amongst the male baboons. And I think that this is independent of culture. This is biology. It's shaped and we've put a veneer of sophistication and all sorts of values associated with what we think are good reasons for doing this or bad reasons. In the old days, the kings used to go to war because that shows I'm a big bad king, right? We still got that sort of attitude going on in this world of ours. So that's what I mean.
Okay, go on, Mike, and then I'll put in a couple of bits
Okay.
on chat.
A, I very much like what you just said. And B, it goes back to the point about the genetic contribution to culture. It's about the physiology, the embedded instincts, if you like, for mating or eating or fighting or whatever else it is. However, the process of engaging with that genetic inheritance, the biology, if you like, imperative of the contribution, brings about certain normalized behaviors which can be coded as emergent and therefore as culture. That then, when you get born into that normalized or enculturated series of behaviors which are about dominance, what constitutes a dominant male, the behavior that attaches to that definition or that sort of judgment, then becomes the culture. So it's that way round. So I very much liked what you said and agree with it. And as a baboon, I don't think I'm doing too badly on that.
A couple of interesting contributions for chat, but I'm aware we're coming up for time, so I'll have to close in a minute to do. So interesting one from Pill. What is considered male and female also differs according to culture. I'm very aware as my first culture has no gender pronoun to begin with.
Yeah.
And also your comment, Peter, about if it's true for baboons, is it really true for us? Well, I think that's wrapped up by the last bit of the conversation.
Oh, it certainly is. Nature doesn't actually discharge the opportunity to replicate its genetic codes, you know. Yeah. We share a lot, us and baboons.
Yes.
And mice and bananas, by the way.
Yes.
I know that because some people say I am bananas. So, yeah.
Great. Well, a couple of minutes to go, so we're nearly at time. So firstly, big thank you to you, Mike and Steve. That was absolutely excellent. So brilliant.
Thank you.
First hour and great stimulation for the conversation. And
so much, brilliant.
Well, thank you for having us. And yeah, this has been really interesting.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So Peter, Steve, Mike, any closing comments you guys want to make, really?
From me, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much.
Agreed. Thank you for the opportunity. It's been good.
Really good.
Yeah, I think this will be one of those that I'll have a lot of questions and thoughts about 2 days from now.
Yeah, that's a good sign.
Yeah.
Yes, you're not
Very
alone
good.
in that,
Thank
I think.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
We'll release the recording in a couple of days. Cheers. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers. Thanks, Peter.
Great work.
Yeah, you too. Thank you. Cheers, Peter. Bye-bye.